Welcome to today's webinar in the Knowledge Miles series, part of the Lord Mayor's lectures on behalf of Alderman Professor Michael Marnelli, whose theme for his mayoral year is Connect to Prosper. In this free online lecture series, we address the connections in and around the square mile, which Michael likes to call the world's coffee house, and how these might help us to tackle future global challenges. I'm Professor Tim Connell, an Emeritus Professor at what is now City St George's, University of London. I'm also Chairman of the Gresham Society and a Fellow of Gresham College here in the city, and I'm a liveryman of the Stationers' Company as well. I'll be convening this session and moderating the questions and answers after today's lectures. So today, very briefly, a quick introduction from me. Then we go over to Commissioner Peter Doherty. We'll be hearing about economic and cybercrime, and then there'll be 20 minutes for questions, which I shall moderate. I'm delighted to introduce Peter Doherty, the recently appointed Commissioner of Police for the City of London. Firstly, Pete, can you tell us a bit more about your time in the police?
Tim, thank you very much. It's a massive privilege and honour for me to be here. And as you said, so I lead the City of London Police. I joined the City Police nearly 20 years ago as a police constable, and find myself now leading an incredible organisation. And of course, Tim, many people understand the City of London Police protects our wonderful square mile, but indeed has a really significant national role in leading the UK policing response to economic crime and cybercrime, which indeed I'll be covering more in a few moments.
Splendid.
So,
now.
Okay, lovely. Well, effectively being the national UK policing lead for economic crime and cybercrime, in essence, means that we lead the local and regional policing response to economic crime and cybercrime, improving the services we give victims. And of course, many of you may know that fraud and cybercrime now constitutes 50% of all crime. And I consider it to be the most significant and most rapidly evolving threat facing the UK. Now, today's input, I'll speak to you a bit about the emerging threat picture to the threat of fraud and cybercrime. But just to begin by saying that when I speak about fraud, I speak about any fraud that impacts individuals or businesses, whether it's romance fraud or mortgage frauds. I'm not speaking about fraud that impacts the government, such as pension fraud or tax evasion. And when I speak about cybercrime, I speak about what I call machine-on-machine crime. This is computers attacking other computers here in the UK and impacting us in numerous ways. Now, there are lots of reasons why perhaps the UK response to economic crime and cybercrime has not been where it ought to have been, such as the complexity of this nature of crime, the fact that many of the criminals attacking the UK live and operate from overseas jurisdictions, which bring in a whole host of complexities around investigations and working with partners to disrupt those criminal enterprises. But actually, being honest, one of the main reasons is I think we've hidden behind an excuse of this being new crime. And so it being so new, we have been struggling to keep up with the pace of change. But actually, I'm not sure that is true, because I'm not sure if many of you appreciate this, but the first ever recorded fraud goes back to 300 years before Christ, BC. A Greek shipping merchant by the name of Pegastratos, who was known for submitting a fraudulent claim against his ship and cargo that went down, and claimed to have had loads of cargo on that ship that he never had, and claimed a healthy bill from insurers. So that was our kind of first ever recorded fraud. And equally on cybercrime, actually the first ever recorded cybercrime goes back to 1834, which was an attack on the French telegraph system, looking to steal financial and market information to have financial gain. So these are not new crimes, but indeed the way in which they are committed is evolving, with increasing use of technology and all the complexity that brings. So in terms of threat, we think over 70% of the fraud impact in the UK does come from overseas, not here in the UK. One of the main reasons why the UK is so susceptible to being a victim of fraud is because of our fast payment system. So in Australia, for example, if you want to send money to someone, it normally takes 24 hours. In the UK, it's instantaneous. Now, of course, that brings numerous advantages, but what it does mean, it makes it much harder to detect fraud because we're so good at sending money to each other in fast time. The City of London Police, so we effectively host a function called Action Fraud. So all the frauds committed against businesses and people in the UK come into Action Fraud. We get about 30,000 reports a month, so at least 30,000 victims every 4 weeks come into us. And we believe that at least 1 in 18 people across the UK at any moment in time are a victim of fraud. And the range of frauds we see are absolutely significant, from romance fraud traditionally committed by fraudsters in West African countries such as Nigeria and Ghana. We see investment scams hosted from the Middle East and all parts of the world, typically buying cryptocurrencies or stocks in companies that don't exist. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the film Wolf of Wall Street. We have offences such as computer service software fraud. This typically has been contact centres in India, some legitimate by day, who then become illegitimate contact centres overnight, who effectively phone people all over the UK pretending to be Microsoft, claiming that their current version of Windows is out of date, and offer a free upgrade because there are security vulnerabilities. And of course, they then remote access that person's laptop or iPhone. They deploy a virus onto that device, such as banking Trojan. And then when that unsuspecting person logs on to online banking, that banking Trojan effectively is recording your username and password, then has your credit card information, and then either uses that to further victimize you, or indeed sells your credit card information on the dark web to other criminals for a fee. So, and equally, I had a phone call from my dad last year. He was worried because my mum had received a text message on WhatsApp. And the message said, "Mother, it's me, and I need your help." My mum then said, "Which one of my sons are you?" The fraudster said, "Which one do you think it is?" My mum said, "It's Peter, because I'm my mum's youngest." And my mum says, "Oh, Peter, what's wrong? We're here to help." And this guy, Peter, says, "Well, I've changed my phones. I can't use Apple Pay, and I need to pay my rent. I need to borrow £2,000. And my dad phoned me, wanting to have a go at me for trying to borrow money from my mum. And of course, it transpired it wasn't me. And I gave them advice. But fraud is everywhere. And they target particularly elderly and vulnerable people, but none of us are safe. And of course, we are seeing changes in how the threats are committed. One example being people running boiler rooms, which are fake companies that phone victims, getting them to invest their pensions and life savings into companies that don't exist. And they're now beginning to use artificial intelligence to help write scripts that they read, that the AI helps them to achieve maximum buy-in from those victims who are unsuspecting, which is incredible. And if you think about it, it was now 12 years ago, I think, we had a Russian crime network who recruited a Russian academic from a state university in Moscow. He was paid $500,000 back then to write a piece of malware or computer virus. They recruited a double agent in a retail bank in the city. The Russian coder sent as an attachment to an email to the banking insider this piece of malware. The banking insider downloaded this malware to 24 cash machines from Newcastle down to Brighton. And what it meant was that once they had downloaded the malware to those cash machines, you didn't need to use a PIN number or a credit card. You had a magic 4-digit number that gave you complete control over that cash machine. They had 12 members of an organised crime network operating here in the UK who effectively went all across those cash machines and took £1.6 million in cash from those cash machines because that virus had meant that they could just simply take all that money with a 4-digit number. So we, of course, arrested everyone operating here in the UK, but we couldn't set foot into Russia because, we don't have that diplomatic relationship. So these are all the kind of challenges we face. And, the impact from fraud is huge. We get suicides every year. There are sucker lists available on the dark web. These are credit card information, phone numbers, email addresses of unsuspecting people. And actually, it was in 2021 that the Royal United Services Institute, which is an independent think tank, said that the threat from fraud facing the UK, its people and businesses, was so severe, it absolutely is a national threat to national security. And that's the position we find ourselves in. And when we think about cybercrime, there's 3 types of people committing cybercrime in the UK. So we have script kiddies. These are young people in their bedrooms doing it for fun and for kudos, who learn to code through online gaming. We have criminals who often attack particularly policing as a form of retaliation in response to us investigating them. But the threat I am most concerned about is the increase in threat from hostile states, particularly, and this is all in the public domain, particularly the likes of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. And actually, going back to 2010-11, some of those countries came out openly and said that they were building IT armies. They have thousands of people in warehouses every day writing malware, botnets, DDoS attacks that are often used to attack Western economies. And the mission is clear. Look, let's impact the US, the UK. Let's disrupt economic stability by attacking infrastructure, particularly utility, gas, water, electricity, critical national infrastructure, that might be banking or policing infrastructure, to effectively destabilize and harm our nations. And I can prove it because even about 6 years before the mobilization of tanks into the Ukraine, what people don't realize that actually the attack on the Ukraine began in 2014, where we had Russian capabilities attacking digital infrastructure being hosted by the Ukraine. And effectively, not meaning to be dramatic, what we have in our hands is what I call a cyber cold war going on in parallel to the physical war we see playing out in the world at the moment. There is a cyber war going on. And of course, some of the capabilities being used to attack us, we know are hostile state sponsored. And so this is a really increasing threat for all of us. It's not just crime. This is what I call modern warfare. And just my last point before I speak to you about what we're doing to address some of this stuff is this. 20 years ago, if you were a cyber criminal, invariably you had to be a coder. And I compare this to terrorism, going back to the terrorist threat in the 90s and up until and immediately after 9/11. To be a terrorist, you were invariably receiving training in the Middle East, understanding explosive equipment, and normally terrorist attacks involved some form of nail bomb or IED or explosive device. But what happened was a few years after 9/11, a lot of the terrorist organizations said, look, don't worry about receiving training that takes months and months and months, getting access to ammunition and explosive devices. Just go and rent a car or buy a knife from a supermarket like Sainsbury's, whatever, and drive over a bridge, knock into as many people as possible, and then kill as many people as possible once you leave your vehicle. In many ways, cyber is becoming like that, a high volume game, because no longer do you need to be a coder to be a cyber criminal. What you need to do is go onto the dark web, and for £200 you can buy a toolkit that gives you everything you need to go and attack 200, 400, 600 people and to steal their credit card information. Okay, so this is a high volume game and it is hugely concerning. However, despite a lot of the challenges we face in policing this threat, and I won't go into this, but how do you enforce threats that exist overseas? We have a big issue around how do we recruit great people into policing and keep them, particularly when industry pay a lot more money. There has been a lack of investment by government in this business area, which is now changing. I think there's a danger of complacency because fraud and cybercrime is happening in such high volumes. There's a real danger of accepting this. And I think also it requires a systematic response. You are not going to solve fraud and cybercrime by arresting people, even when that can happen. And it requires government, industry, policing, and other partners to come together, share data, understand who the most significant players are in this space, and disrupt them before they reach and harm victims. So let me just give you a few minutes on what we're doing before we come on to questions. So up until about 3 years ago, the UK policing response to economic crime and cybercrime, in my opinion, was wholly reactive. So in essence, victims report fraud and cybercrime. We then assess those crimes and we do our very best to investigate them. And even when we can get victims' money back, and we have a really good relationship with the banks to do this and others, and even if we can arrest a person, let's say they're in the UK, or they are in a country where there is a good diplomatic relationship, that's really important work to deliver justice. But the reality is that that work is not going to reduce fraud or cybercrime. And so about 2 years ago now, the government developed and implemented a new fraud strategy. And in essence, over the last 2 years, we're really beginning now to make an impact on reducing fraud. And about a year after the publication of that strategy, we're already proving that we had reduced fraud between 10 and 13% in that 1 year period. What it has meant is, with lots of new funding, from a policing point of view, we have built what I call proactive teams all over the UK. So instead of waiting for victims to report fraud and then us investigating and bringing people to justice, we're now harnessing intelligence across government, industry, and other partners to actually proactively determine who are the fraudsters affecting the UK and cyber criminals, and let's work to disrupt their efforts before they reach and harm victims. And there's loads of good work going on in that regard. We have a people strategy now in place, so we're doing lots of work to attract and recruit highly talented people into this space. For example, we're about to go live with a new direct entry detective scheme, meaning that if you want to work in the police as a detective, you don't need to join as a uniform officer and patrol the streets for a few years. You can come directly from university and be a financial investigator or a fraud investigator immediately. And also doing lots of work around improved training, but also working with industry to do exchanges. So I might have a senior fraud investigator that goes and work in industry to learn how they work. We may have people from industry coming into policing, sharing intelligence, co-location, sharing that data in real time to understand these new fraud trends so we can disrupt them, identifying fraudsters and working together to disrupt them rapidly. Also, problem solving. And I want to give you a quick example. A few moments ago, I spoke to you about a common fraud we had, which were contact centers in India, phoning victims, pretending to be Microsoft, and putting viruses on their machines. Now, we went some way in really beginning to solve that problem, and this is how we did it. So we got Microsoft to come and work in our department. They worked with us for a couple of years, looking at all the crimes being reported into our system to understand what could they do to prevent this. We flew to India and worked with the Indian government and said, look, you've got a contact center issue, and we would really want you to implement a robust regulatory framework to try and prevent these contact centers harming UK victims. And in the beginning, even though they perhaps didn't support it, you remind colleagues in India that so many of the big companies in the UK, particularly retailers and banks, fund contact centers in India. And of course, when the government hear a message from the UK government which says, well, if you don't work with us on this, we're not going to put our contact centers in India, we'll put them elsewhere, the impact to Indian GDP is huge. So, of course, they were really keen to help us. Over the course of half a year, we were showing intelligence for the Indians. We identified the 13 most prolific contact centers operating across India, worked with Indian law enforcement and effectively arrested people and collapsed those contact centers. And we believe in the few years that followed, we reduced computer service software fraud by about 87%. Microsoft came back to the UK and it changed the way it contacted its customers. So no longer would Microsoft cold call consumers. You'd have to have a registered account, go online, so that you knew if you had to speak to Microsoft, it was done in a proper way. And then we did a really proactive communications campaign around, look, if you get a phone call, don't fall for this, don't fall for that. So that was the National Crime Agency, industry, government and police, and working together as a system to solve a problem. And that's how we're going to begin to really reduce this threat from fraud. Some other quick examples, and I'm mindful of my time. So there's new legislation that's coming in to really hold industry to account. So, for example, we have a telecoms charter, a bank charter, and soon to be a tech charter, which effectively gets industry to sign up to a set of rules that they will take a proactive effort in protecting consumers and preventing crime. Another thing is the online harms bill. So again, making social media companies like Meta and others do loads of work to disrupt advertising on their platforms that effectively lead to scams and people being defrauded. And actually, if they don't conform, they can be liable to penalties. So there is much more accountability coming into industry to get them to do more. So that's just some examples. The other bit is we're looking to slow down the payment system just for a short period of time so we can better detect fraud and protect consumers. We're getting policing to do more by effectively holding police to account through the Inspectorate, which is Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabularies. Up until this point, we have never beat it to stick at policing to say what you're doing to respond to fraud isn't good enough. Now that will hopefully become part of our accountability system and get policing to do more. Also, we need to be creative and innovative. So we appreciate that those 30,000 victims who report interaction fraud every 4 weeks, we're never going to investigate all of those crimes. But what more can we do for victims? So one of many examples, we now have a capability here in the City of London Police where we identify all those cyber enablers that have been used to approach people. By cyber enabler, I mean a bank account of a suspect or fraudster where monies are being sent to, a telephone number that is repeatedly being used overseas to contact victims in the UK, email addresses, and more. We now have built a relationship with a whole myriad of companies. We then every day share information on those enablers to those companies, and they work day and night to disrupt those platforms, protecting more victims and reducing repeat victimization. So that's one of many examples we're doing, and we take about 2,000 of those enablers out every few months. So as you can see, just to summarize, the way in which we're going to reduce fraud and cybercrime and do better for the public is by legislation that gets industry, whether it's tech companies, social media companies, banks, and more, to do more to prevent fraud and cybercrime early on. It's giving policing the powers it needs to work proactively with government, to share intelligence, identify harmful fraudsters and cyber criminals, and working overseas to disrupt them and take them out before they're able to harm people. And I think lastly, having the legislation that enables us to do this, and also making sure that we work with industry to attract, recruit, retain, and develop the very best to come into policing, work with us to solve all of these problems. So I could talk to you all day about this stuff, but I think that's probably enough for now. I want to leave enough time for questions, and I'm handing back to Tim.
Yes, well, Pete, thank you very much indeed. A massive amount of information in a very short time. I must ask one first question, though. You have a banner there for Economic Crime Academy. Is this where criminals go to learn about economic crime, or are you actually training people to actually prevent it?
The latter. So yeah, in essence, Tim, good question. So one of the many services we have here in the city, that's a national service, is the academy you've mentioned. What the academy does, it trains thousands of police officers up and down the UK how to better investigate fraud and cybercrime, particularly because technologies are changing and methodologies employed by criminals are changing. But it also gives training to industry people, and lastly, does some capability building overseas to help other countries learn from the UK and how to better stop and investigate these crimes.
Yeah, oh, phenomenal. Now, I'm not surprised. I think we've had more questions for this particular webinar than anyone we've had during the year, and some fairly specialised ones, I have to say. One from Dan Feeney here. When will both online and offline crime statistics be combined across the UK? Once government addresses the true impact on society, perhaps they don't tell the story truly at the moment.
That's an excellent question. That was certainly true up until 2016, when the crime survey for England and Wales only counted offline crime, as it were. Now, back then we had about 6.5 million offences a year. However, for 2016, they included fraud and computer misuse act offences. And so crime in this country effectively doubled overnight. So we do actually now count fraud and cybercrime in the crime survey for England and Wales.
Right. Amy Green has an interesting one about training and education. Is a pathway via a university degree needed now to put an end to all of this? And do university degrees in relevant subjects, say in computer science, actually include a fraud prevention module, for example?
Again, no, that's a really good point. So first of all, to join policing as a police officer, there are various entry routes. Some require you to have a degree and some do not. To work within fraud and cybercrime, you're already in policing, so you go through a training program. When you join the police, you get modules on fraud and you get modules on computer misuse act offences at a very basic level. To the point about universities, I actually studied mathematics and computer science, although a long time ago, and there was nothing on crime prevention. And I guess why would there be? I was learning about coding and networking and infrastructure. But it's a good point, and there may be an opportunity to do it to raise awareness in the future. So I'll certainly take that away as a good idea. Thank you.
That would be a good one to raise with the Office for Students, perhaps. Samuel Marchant, a very topical point. Will AI used by criminals mean you need to adapt in order to tackle crime? And will you be able to use machine learning to help fight it?
100%. If we do not, we are all vulnerable. And as I
Yeah.
mentioned before, we have seen early signs of criminals using automation, machine learning, and even AI. So we absolutely need to. We're doing some work already. Most of it's automation. So, for example, in our contact center, we use chatbots to drive efficiencies for public reporting. Um, we're actually replacing action fraud next year, and we will be using some AI in that new system. One example would be, as these crime reports come in every minute of the day, using automation and AI instead of human analysts to constantly analyze trend and typologies, instantly convert that into fraud prevention advice, and instantly get it back out to victims based upon their unique circumstances. So this is a better service for the victims, and of course, a more efficiency for police, and so we become more value for money. But there's a lot of opportunities around how policing uses AI to detect AI criminality. One example are deepfakes. You may have read in the news recently the riots in Southport that happened following the tragic murder of the three young girls up north. Actually, in part, was triggered by fake news by a cyber criminal now convicted. So actually, we need to use technology to identify technology being used by criminals, whether it's deepfakes or other crime.
Interesting. We were talking about this just before we started. I raised the question about crime in a foreign language, and you said that actually AI is quite useful in spotting something which isn't genuine. Is that the case?
Yeah, so I think what AI can do, it can look at phraseology to determine geolocation. So so I'll give you one example. Romance fraud, which plagues our nation, right? So one of the trends we've seen, Tim, is a fraudster, let's say operating from a jurisdiction out east, who claims to be a US national in the US Army who's lonely. Now, what AI could do is one, it could give you a really good estimation around where actually this person is operating from based on language, but also based upon culture and approach. So that's one benefit. The other benefit is if a script has been written by AI and being used by a criminal to target a victim, AI can also identify if that script has been written by AI itself or indeed by a human being. So, the opportunities are endless here. So yeah, loads of opportunities for us to see going forward.
Gosh. Yes, I suppose this is quite a relevant one as well from Richard Burge. Given the vast number of reported crimes every month, what is the turnaround time for even starting investigations, and how can you avoid being simply swamped, let alone solving these crimes?
So let me answer the latter question first. We are swamped. Yeah, we are swamped. Um, the way in which we change the game here is to not be reactive to crimes coming in, is to prevent them from happening in the first place. And I gave you some examples as to how we're doing that. Such a proactive fraud investigation team. There's 9 around the country that we lead here. We do intensification periods where we pick a fraud type like romance fraud or courier fraud. We share intelligence to identify the most serious fraudsters. And as a UK police service, for 1 week, go out every day and arrest them all. And so that prevents them doing it in the future. So that's one way, for example. But we do need to increase capacity across policing to do more on this because we are swamped. And also I think industry, things like security by design. If a new phone is released, a new iPhone, for example, or online banking provides a new service to customers, it's making sure that yes, you want to give a good customer experience, but it's making sure that they predict every possible vector of attack on a new application or device and work with us to do security by design, to anticipate the exploitation of that piece of hardware and put provisions in place to make it almost impossible. So, you know, different ways of doing this.
Yeah. Clive Bullen, like many of us, had a harsh experience of fraud attack. I was contacted by my bank this week due to a transaction that went through saying that they'd spotted it was fake. How is it likely that they actually spotted something like that?
banks have become really good actually at identifying transactions that need to be questioned. And I have to say, well, first of all, I should say I'm really sorry to hear about what happened to you. It happens to so many, sadly. And I remember recently, I personally had to move some of my own money to remortgage my house. And I was on the phone to the bank for an hour trying to convince them it was a legitimate transaction. So the banks are doing some really good work about this, and actually they're using automation and technology as well as really competent, qualified people to look at all of these transactions and question their legitimacy, whether it's the nature of the transaction, the amount, which is out of the ordinary, or indeed a jurisdiction or an account that money is going to that they've got a concern about. And let's not forget that up until recently, banks invariably refunded people who lost money to what we call an unauthorized push payment fraud. Now, even in authorized push payment fraud, the banks now in new legislation have to refund victims where that loss is over a certain amount. So the banks are doing some really good work to prevent, protect, and reimburse.
Oh, that's good. Your first piece of fan mail here from Paul Phillips. Very sobering to know the scale of these crimes, but also encouraging to find out what is being done to disrupt its impact. So thank you for your work to protect us. Of course, the trouble is, if you tell everybody what you're doing to prevent the fraud, you might be giving a lead to the criminals to see what you're doing and therefore to try and get round it. How open can you be about what you actually do?
As much as I have been open today, of course,
This is
look,
being watched in
everyone
Russia.
knows. But look, everyone will appreciate there's aspects to our business that I can't speak about. Um, but it's such an open knowledge that one of the biggest cyber threats to us is comes from Russia. This is reported on frequently in the press. Um, and I also think that to an extent, if criminals are aware that this is a priority for us, that we are proactive and we are working together across the UK system, industry, together with government and policing, I hope that to an extent it's a form of deterrence in itself. You know, it's like when you go to your local city and it says, be warned, plainclothes detectives are operating here. Now, we don't have to tell people that. But actually, if we tell them that, it may dissuade people from committing the crime. So it's a sweet spot balance, I think, to be achieved.
Right. Now, I warned you we might get some technical questions. Here's one from Andrew Churchill. Do you believe the recognised legitimate interest in the Data Use and Access Bill for financial crime data sharing will help provide greater intelligence between private and public sector investigations?
I can't comment on that. I've not read it. I'm not briefed on that at the moment, but I'll take that away for me to plug a gap in my knowledge. I've met Andrew before. Hello, Andrew. Good to hear from you. Incredibly competent person, and always teaching me new things. So I'll take that away to have a look at. I wouldn't want to comment on something I know little about at the moment.
No. Well, it's good to see that actually legislation, I suppose legislation is always rather retroactive, but good to see there's actually something in the system that's going to help somewhere. Now, Nigel Rothwell asking about procedures. What happens after I forward a phishing email to the report@phishing.gov.uk email address? What happens about it?
Yeah, great question. And unfortunately, phishing has been such a significant issue, and one of the main vehicles for people to obtain personal information that then is used for further crimes. I have to say though, through the Telecoms Charter, I think the industry has disrupted something like 97% of phishing platforms being used to target people. And I hope, Tim, people on this call, like me, have received this or seen a step change. So I used to get loads of phone calls. You've been in a car accident recently, or the HMRC have a warrant for your arrest for not paying your taxes. A lot of that has stopped now because industry has shut down all of these platforms. Plus, government has banned cold calling, except for pensions, I think it is. So that's the first point. The second point is that information, we get some of the phishing information through Action Fraud. And again, we will work with our partners to disrupt those platforms. Now, that is really important work. But of course, as we know, it's quite easy then for people to then start a new website or to create a new email address. And industry is doing a lot of work around making it harder for people to open an account with verifiable information. And there continues to be a debate, doesn't there, about an ID card here in the UK. But there are some people who quite rightly support the need that when you start an email or a bank account, there needs to be proper verifiable information, whether it's a passport, driving license, an ID card, an address, proof of residence, etc., etc. So all of this work is going on in response to the phishing problem.
So you favour two-step verification, for example?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting query from Mariana C. We seem to have a lot of punishment in place. What about incentives for people to comply or to come forward, compliance on the part of companies? Are you getting a positive response, A, from the general public and B, from companies?
Now, this is such an interesting point. So, we've always believed that something like 80% of the fraud reported to us could be prevented if consumers and small businesses took the necessary precautions to protect themselves. But equally, police and government, we've not always been as proactive as we ought to have been to give the public appropriate, meaningful messaging. And also, how do you give messaging to an 18-year-old who spends 4 hours a day gaming on the metaverse and a 75-year-old like my dad who's not online at all? However, about a year and a half ago, government launched the Think Stop Fraud campaign, and industry bodies, police and government, all of our protect messaging or prevention messaging is aligned to that campaign. So if you're a member of the public, if you get a prevention message, be it a text message or an email, if it's aligned to that theme of Think Stop Fraud, you know it's genuine. And that campaign continues to have a massive positive impact in protecting people and reducing fraud. So that's the first bit. And I think the public, although it's quite early, have been very responsive to that. Industry have been very responsive because actually they know it's a government priority, and to some extent, the new legislation that has come in, like the online safety bill, it requires them to do so. And if not, there are consequences to that. And lastly, quick thing. So we have situations of young people being involved in cybercrime. I had a story 3 years ago, 15-year-old in school hacked the school server to steal GCSE answers. Now, we could arrest him, but is that the right outcome for society, the public, and that boy? What we did do was we put him on a rehabilitation program, training, and he ended up achieving an apprenticeship with IBM, and he's been clean ever since. Right, so we've saved a young person. We've worked with industry, rehabilitation. So yes, we're doing all of that.
Yes, no, that's very encouraging. One interesting thing about our Lord Mayor's lectures is the number of individuals who've been in touch with the speaker to ask for further contact. I don't think I can do this because of confidentiality, but there is a lady who's recently left cyber policing and she'd like to talk to you further about working with industry. She's named her company. In fact, Pete, you do see the questions and answers afterwards. So if you'd like to contact the lady about that, that would be a further bonus for the Lord Mayor's lectures. On to Eleonora Di Benedetto. Very insightful. Thank you for this. You mentioned the cross-jurisdictional nature of cybercrime, the challenges this represents for data sharing and enforcing sentences. How do you think this will change in the future, and can you change it?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? So in many cases, it's sometimes difficult to even understand where a cyber threat is coming from. So they'll use things like proxy servers, they will mask their location. And if we don't have a relationship with a country where we think it may be coming from, it's difficult to often prove it. So that's your first challenge. The second challenge is if it's coming from a jurisdiction where there is strong diplomacy between the UK and that country, we have the provisions in place to share data and work together. The challenge is jurisdictions where we don't have a good relationship with, right? I do think in the future, as we embark upon the increased globalization of goods, people, and services, it is going to require policing to work internationally more than ever before, and not just within fraud and cybercrime. And I do think that we need more modernised treaties and frameworks to share data and work together. One quick example, in the UK, if we've got a website that we think are committing fraud, we actually don't need to get an order from a judge. We speak to Nominet. If it's a .co.uk website, it's down in 2 days at most. In the US, you have to go and get an order from a judge to close down a website. And so we have a great relationship with the US, but if there is a website hosted in the US impacting the UK, the time to disrupt it is much longer. So to answer this question, I think a set of common standards and ways of working across the world between friendly countries, so we all operate to best practice in a common framework to improve service to victims no matter where they live.
All right. Fred, we're running out of time. So many interesting questions. It's a great topic. Thank you very much, Peter. I've enjoyed this one. Chris David comes up with an interesting suggestion. What about proper ID verification for people when they register a company at Companies House? Is there a background check on people claiming to be directors?
Up until 3 years ago, the process to initiate an account with Company House, let's just say it needed some improvement. The Treasury Select Committee did a review into economic crime in 2021, I think it was. One of the recommendations was a reform to Companies House, whereby when you now initiate an account with Companies House, I think the fee's a bit more, and there's increased verification into the person applying for that account. I don't know if that process is finished. It may have been finished, but certainly was an action Companies House inherited, and some really good work was happening to change it. I just don't know if it's been completed. But yeah, that is happened or definitely happening.
Right, well, I'm very sorry to say we're running short of time, but I'm going to be perfectly selfish. Something I noticed in your details is being the lead for regarding intellectual property crime. Sorry, is that? Yes. Intellectual property is an interesting one because it's not quite tangible. What does that work consist of?
Well, interestingly, Tim, I should have said, and thank you for this, within being the national lead for fraud and cybercrime, but also the national lead for intellectual property crime, which you've mentioned, money laundering and bribery and corruption. On your question, effectively, this relates to the counterfeiting of goods shipped into the UK and then delivered to consumers and small businesses. And it may be counterfeit car parts, counterfeit clothing, fashion goods, jewelry, and of course, there's a public harms issue here. So, for example, we've had stories of vehicles having counterfeit parts where there's been an accident, the seatbelt hasn't worked, and the person's died or whatever. So it's really, really serious. And so effectively, we lead the policing response to that and make sure that policing is equipped with the skills and tools it needs to investigate intellectual property fraud, which is mostly the counterfeiting of goods, most of which comes in from outside jurisdictions, particularly China.
Gosh, very, very interesting. Well, that's yet another area for you to have to cover. And I'm afraid cybercrime and fraud, regrettably, seem to be a regular feature of both working and private life nowadays. So I think we're very grateful for the work which is being done. And very interesting to see that the City of London, I think quite rightly and characteristically, is taking a lead at national and indeed at international level. So, of course, thank you very much indeed to Peter Doherty, Commissioner for the City of London Police. And I think this is another fine example of the way in which the City of London can lead the world. This, of course, is actually the last in the Lord Mayor's Lecture Series, as it's the end of Michael Manelli's year as Lord Mayor, and what a year it's been. So I'd like to thank all of our viewers, especially the regulars who've signed up for so many of our lectures during the year. This lecture and all our lectures are recorded, posted on the Gresham Society website, and also on our YouTube channel, in case you'd like to revisit anything else. And all of this has been support of the Lord Mayor's theme for the year, which has been to connect to prosper. So thank you very much indeed, Pete. Thank you very much to the audience, and goodbye.
Thank you.